Everyone thought the young African leader had come to Germany seeking aid, until they heard Traoré's response to Scholz's massive €8 billion industrial offer. The November wind was particularly bitter in Berlin, as Ibrahim Traoré's convoy made its way through the German capital's historic streets. At 34, the Burkinabe president had become accustomed to the protocols of international diplomacy, but this visit felt different. Chancellor Olaf Scholz had personally extended the invitation, promising what German officials were calling the most comprehensive industrial partnership proposal ever offered to an African nation. For months, German intelligence had been tracking the seismic shifts occurring across West Africa. One by one, former French colonies were breaking free from traditional European influence, embracing what they called true sovereignty. But it was Ibrahim Traoré who had emerged as the most articulate and influential voice of this new African awakening. His rejection of Western military presence, his nationalization of gold mines, and his pivot toward Russia and China had sent alarm bells ringing across European capitals. Chancellor Scholz understood the stakes better than most of his European counterparts. Germany's industrial dominance depended heavily on African raw materials, from rare earth minerals essential for renewable energy technology to lithium needed for electric vehicle batteries. If the Traoré effect continued spreading across the continent, Germany's carefully constructed supply chains could face disruption on an unprecedented scale. The meeting was arranged with unusual secrecy. Unlike typical state visits, there would be no press conferences, no joint statements, and minimal media coverage. This was to be a private conversation between two leaders about the future of German-African economic relations, away from the scrutiny of both European critics and African nationalists, who might view any cooperation with former colonial powers as betrayal. As Traoré was escorted through the Chancellery's modern corridors, he reflected on how different this felt from his previous encounters with European leaders. French President Macron had been condescending, treating him like a wayward child who needed guidance. British officials had been dismissive, apparently unable to believe that a leader from such a small, poor country could pose any real challenge to established international order. But the German approach was different. Scholz had done his homework. The briefing materials German diplomats had provided showed a sophisticated understanding of Traoré's motivations, his political base, and his long-term vision for African development. More importantly, they seemed to grasp that this was not a man driven by personal enrichment or susceptible to traditional forms of diplomatic pressure. Scholz was waiting in his private office when Traoré arrived, rising to greet his guests with the respectful formality that characterized German diplomacy. At 65, the Chancellor brought decades of experience in both economics and politics to this crucial conversation. He had served as Germany's finance minister during some of the country's most challenging economic periods, and understood better than most the critical importance of secure resource supply chains. President Traoré, Scholz said in careful English, his accent thick but his words precise. Welcome to Berlin. I hope you found the journey comfortable. Chancellor Scholz, Traoré replied, his handshake firm and his manner composed. Thank you for the invitation. I must say, I'm curious about this industrial partnership proposal your diplomats have been discussing. They settled into leather chairs arranged around a small conference table, the room's stark modernist design reflecting Germany's preference for functionality over ornate display. Scholz gestured to a thick folder placed before him. President Traoré, I want to begin with complete honesty. Germany recognizes that Africa is changing rapidly, and we acknowledge that our previous approaches to African partnership have often been inadequate. Today, I want to present something entirely different. Traoré leaned forward slightly, his expression attentive but guarded. I appreciate directness, Chancellor. Please continue. Scholz opened the folder, revealing charts, graphs, and detailed technical drawings. What I'm proposing is the largest German industrial investment in Africa in history. €8 billion over 7 years, focused on building genuine manufacturing capacity across the Sahel region. The numbers were indeed staggering. Traoré had expected perhaps a modest aid package or some technical assistance programs. €8 billion represented more than 5 times Burkina Faso's entire GDP. This is not traditional development aid, Scholz continued, warming to his theme. This is genuine industrial partnership. We're proposing to build complete automotive assembly plants in Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger. Electric vehicle manufacturing, solar panel production, battery assembly, semiconductor fabrication, the full spectrum of 21st century industry. Traoré studied the documents carefully. The proposal was impressively comprehensive, covering everything from initial infrastructure development to worker training programs. German engineering giants like Siemens, BMW, and Volkswagen were prepared to establish major manufacturing operations across West Africa. The employment potential is enormous, Scholz explained. Conservative estimates suggest at least 300,000 direct jobs, with perhaps double that number in supporting industries. This could transform the economic landscape of the entire region. For several minutes, Traoré continued reviewing the materials in silence. The German proposal was far more sophisticated than anything he had seen from other European powers. It addressed many of the concerns he had repeatedly raised about Africa's need for genuine industrialization rather than perpetual dependence on raw material exports. Chancellor Scholz, Traoré finally said, "This is an impressive proposal. The scale and scope are certainly beyond what we've seen from other European partners. May I ask what has motivated Germany to make such an extraordinary commitment to African industrial development?" Scholz chose his words carefully. Germany's prosperity has always depended on industrial excellence and secure supply chains. We recognize that the old model of extracting raw materials from Africa and manufacturing finished goods in Europe is neither sustainable nor fair. We believe genuine partnership requires shared prosperity. And what would Germany expect in return for this investment? Here was the crucial question. Scholz had spent weeks with his advisors debating how to frame German interests without triggering the anti-colonial sensitivities that had derailed so many other European initiatives in Africa. We would expect preferential access to the raw materials needed for these industries: lithium, rare earth minerals, precious metals. Not exclusive access, but priority consideration for German companies. We would also hope for continued cooperation on security matters and alignment with German positions in international forums. Traoré nodded thoughtfully, then closed the folder and leaned back in his chair. When he spoke, his voice carried a tone of patient explanation that Scholz would later describe as both respectful and devastating. "Chancellor Scholz, what you're proposing is certainly more sophisticated than traditional colonial arrangements. But if I may speak frankly, it's still fundamentally the same relationship with better packaging." Scholz felt his heart sink, but Traoré continued in the same measured tone. "You offer to build factories in Africa, which sounds generous until you realize that these factories would be owned by German companies, managed by German executives, using German technology, and producing goods primarily for German markets. The raw materials would still flow to Europe at preferential prices, and the profits would still return to German shareholders." The young African leader stood and walked to the window, gazing out at Berlin's carefully reconstructed cityscape. "Chancellor, do you know what genuine industrial partnership would look like?" Scholz remained silent, sensing that he was about to receive an education that would fundamentally alter his understanding of African aspirations. Genuine partnership would mean African ownership of these industries. It would mean technology transfer that allows us to develop our own engineering capabilities. It would mean processing our raw materials locally for our own markets first, with surplus available for export at market prices we determine. Traoré turned back toward Scholz, his expression serious but not hostile. "Most importantly, it would mean respect for our sovereignty to make economic decisions that serve African interests, even when those decisions conflict with German preferences." "But President Traoré," Scholz interjected, "what you're describing would require massive capital investment and technical expertise that simply doesn't exist in Africa yet. The development timeline would be decades rather than years, and the risk of failure would be enormous." "Chancellor," Traoré replied with a slight smile, "that's exactly what European powers said about Asian development 50 years ago. It's what they said about Latin American industrialization. It's what they said about Eastern European transition after the Cold War. Yet all of these regions eventually developed their own industrial capabilities when they were given the opportunity to do so." Scholz realized he was facing something he had not fully anticipated, not a leader seeking assistance, but one articulating a completely different vision of international economic relations. "The fundamental issue," Traoré continued, returning to his seat, "is that European proposals are always designed to maintain European advantages. You offer to build factories that we cannot independently operate, using technologies we cannot modify or replicate, producing goods for markets we cannot access directly." He picked up the German proposal again, flipping through several pages. "These automotive plants you're proposing, would Burkina Faso have the right to manufacture vehicles for export to European markets under our own brand names?" Scholz hesitated. The proposal had assumed that manufacturing would occur under license from German companies, with distribution controlled by existing European networks. "I see," Traoré said, noting the pause. And these solar panel factories, would we be free to develop our own photovoltaic technologies, or would we be dependent on German patents and licensing agreements? Again, Scholz found himself without a satisfactory answer. The German model was predicated on maintaining technological leadership while outsourcing manufacturing to lower-cost locations. Chancellor Scholz, I don't question Germany's sincere desire for partnership, but what you're offering is a more generous form of the same dependent relationship that has characterized Africa-Europe economic ties for centuries. You would remain the brain, we would remain the hands. The conversation continued for another hour, with Scholz offering various modifications to address Traoré's concerns. More favorable financing terms, increased local management participation, expanded worker training programs. Each concession was politely acknowledged but fundamentally rejected. You're asking us to restructure the entire global industrial system, Scholz finally said, a note of frustration creeping into his voice. These supply chains have been built over decades. The technological advantages European companies possess represent massive investments in research and development. Chancellor, Traoré responded, I'm not asking you to restructure anything. I'm simply explaining why Africa is choosing to build its own industrial capacity through partnerships with countries that don't require us to remain permanently subordinate. Are you referring to China and Russia? I'm referring to any partner willing to engage with us as equals rather than as junior participants in a system designed to perpetuate their advantages. Scholz leaned forward. President Traoré, surely you understand that Chinese and Russian partnerships come with their own constraints and dependencies. They're not offering genuine equality either. Perhaps not, Traoré acknowledged, but they are offering technology transfer, joint ownership structures, and respect for our sovereign decision-making. Most importantly, they're willing to help us build capabilities that eventually allow for genuine independence. The meeting was clearly not proceeding as Scholz had hoped. He had expected to negotiate terms and conditions, not to have the fundamental premises of German-African economic relations challenged so comprehensively. What would it take, Scholz asked, for Germany to be considered as a genuine partner rather than a sophisticated colonizer? Traoré was quiet for several minutes, apparently weighing his response carefully. Chancellor, it would require Germany to accept that successful African industrialization might eventually compete with German industries. It would mean sharing technologies and expertise even when doing so reduces German competitive advantages. Most fundamentally, it would require accepting that Africa's development goals might not always align with European interests and supporting our right to pursue those goals anyway. Scholz absorbed this response with the growing realization that traditional European approaches to Africa were facing an existential challenge. The old model of offering aid and investment in exchange for preferential access and political alignment was being rejected by a new generation of African leaders who genuinely believed in the possibility of independent development. President Traoré, I respect your vision, but I must ask, what evidence do you have that alternative partnerships will deliver better outcomes for African people? Chancellor, the evidence is already emerging. The countries that have embraced genuine partnership with China and Russia are building manufacturing capabilities, developing technological expertise, and creating employment opportunities that didn't exist under European partnerships. Traoré stood, signaling that the meeting was approaching its conclusion. More importantly, they're building confidence in their ability to determine their own economic destiny. That psychological shift is perhaps more valuable than any specific industrial project. As the two leaders shook hands, Scholz felt he had witnessed something historically significant, not just the failure of a specific negotiation, but the emergence of a fundamentally new framework for international economic relations. I hope our countries can find ways to cooperate in the future, Scholz said as they walked toward the door. So do I, Chancellor, but it will have to be cooperation between equals, based on mutual respect rather than mutual dependency. The aftermath of the meeting sent shockwaves through German industrial and political circles. Within hours, Scholz was fielding calls from major German corporations asking how negotiations with Traoré had gone so badly wrong. The assumption had been that offering substantial investment would secure German economic interests in a region increasingly hostile to European influence. Instead, Germany had encountered a leader who viewed European offers through the lens of historical exploitation and found them wanting, regardless of their financial generosity. The €8 billion proposal, which German officials had considered extraordinarily generous, had been politely but firmly rejected as insufficiently transformative of underlying power relationships. In the weeks following Traoré's visit, German intelligence agencies agencies reported accelerating African pivot toward non-European partnerships. The rejection of Germany's largest ever African industrial proposal was seen across the continent as evidence that even the most generous European offers were inadequate to address African aspirations for genuine independence. European Union officials convened emergency sessions to address what they termed the African sovereignty crisis. But by then, the momentum had shifted decisively. Traoré's example of rejecting substantial European offers in favor of more equitable partnerships was inspiring similar decisions across the continent. 6 months after the Berlin meeting, Burkina Faso announced a comprehensive industrial development agreement with a consortium of Russian and Chinese companies. The deal involved smaller financial commitments than Germany's rejected proposal, but included provisions for technology transfer, joint ownership, and phased transition to complete African control of all manufacturing facilities. German industrial leaders watched these developments with growing alarm. The African market they had hoped to secure through generous partnership offers was instead being developed by competitors who were willing to accept less favorable terms in exchange for strategic positioning in rapidly growing economies. The meeting between Scholz and Traoré would later be recognized as a pivotal moment in the evolution of global economic relations, the point at which traditional European approaches to Africa definitively failed, not through military defeat or economic coercion, but through the simple power of moral clarity and the insistence on genuine equality. In his memoirs, Scholz would write that his conversation with Ibrahim Traoré had fundamentally altered his understanding of contemporary international relations. "We discovered," he noted, "that there are some things that even 8 billion euros cannot buy: dignity, equality, and the right to determine one's own future." The young African leader had come to Berlin not seeking aid, but offering a lesson in the changing dynamics of global power. And in politely, but firmly rejecting Germany's most generous offer, he had demonstrated that the era of European dominance over African development was irreversibly ending. The ripple effects of that November meeting in Berlin extended far beyond German-African relations. Within weeks, intelligence reports from across Europe documented what analysts termed the Berlin effect, a cascading series of African rejections of European partnership proposals that had previously been considered generous and attractive. French corporations found their offers to build manufacturing facilities in Ivory Coast and Senegal suddenly subjected to new scrutiny by governments that had previously been eager for European investment. Italian proposals for infrastructure development in Libya were rejected outright, with Libyan officials citing Traoré's critique of sophisticated colonialism as justification for seeking alternative partners. Even more concerning for European leaders was the intellectual framework that Traoré had articulated. His distinction between genuine partnership and sophisticated colonialism provided African leaders with a vocabulary for critiquing European proposals without appearing to reject development altogether. The concept of technological sovereignty, the right to own and control industrial capabilities rather than merely hosting foreign-owned operations, became a rallying cry across the continent. The European Union's response was swift but ultimately ineffective. Emergency sessions in Brussels produced a series of policy papers outlining new approaches to African partnership, but these documents largely restated existing commitments with updated language. The fundamental European assumption that African development required European leadership and expertise remained unchanged, making meaningful adaptation impossible. Meanwhile, Traoré's rejection of the German proposal had elevated his status within international forums to unprecedented levels. At the following African Union summit, he was invited to deliver the keynote address on economic sovereignty in the 21st century. His speech, broadcast live across Africa and translated into multiple languages, outlined a comprehensive vision for continental industrialization based on African ownership, South-South cooperation, and graduated independence from Western economic systems. The Berlin meeting, Traoré told the assembled African leaders, demonstrated that European powers